Welcome. Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Maria Tomai will defend the academic thesis, Socio-Technical Transitions Towards Circular and Sustainable Economies, the case of solid waste management in Ghana. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you very much. Dear Prorector, dear members of the committee, family, friends, and colleagues. Thank you for joining me here today in the public defense of my PhD dissertation on socio-technical transitions towards circular and sustainable economies. The motivation and the whole idea behind this PhD research actually started and came to life in 2018. During my first field visit in Ghana, thanks to my supervisor who assigned me a short research project on exploring the circular economy innovations in developing countries. I quickly realized when I landed there that the sanitation challenges related to waste management were nothing close to what I have ever imagined or studied before. And this is something that I will try to visually explain to you also today in the next few minutes. However, before we delve into the case and my research, we should know that this is not a phenomenon we only notice in Ghana. As we speak, the world generates over 2 billion tons of municipal solid waste annually, and this is expected to increase to 3.8 billion by 2050. While this trend might be less visible in the developed world we live, its effects are much more severe in developing countries, where about 93% of the waste end up in landfills or dump sites, comparing to less than 40% here in developed countries. At the same time, climate crisis and socioeconomic challenges put an even stronger pressure on developing countries to devise solutions that address their current needs while also building resilience against future shocks. Ghana is a representative example, a representative case of a developing country that is facing these issues. There are three stylized facts about Ghana that I would like to bring to your attention. First, it is a highly urbanized country with over half of its population living in cities. Then we also observe that about 8% of greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to the waste management activities in the country. Based on the latest UN reports, about 1 person dies every hour from preventable hygiene-related diseases. The puzzle, or the dilemma, if you want, that we are called to face at the moment is how can we transition away from this landfill-dependent model to a waste management system that effectively balances environmental, economic, and social sustainability. So in other words, how can we move away from state A to state B? To solve this puzzle, I centered my research around the literature on socio-technical systems. We can describe a socio-technical system as a compilation of technologies, policies, infrastructures, user practices, which work all together, and they are designed to serve various needs, such as housing, energy, transportation, or waste management, like in my case. A socio-technical system and the relevant transition frameworks and the literature on which I'm relying on help us to understand that change is not driven by technology only, but by this dynamic interplay of all these factors. So to be able to say how change can happen from state A to state B, we need to first study the past trajectories of the system, we need to understand its current state, and we also need to try to project and estimate the potential future pathways. And as you can imagine, this is not an easy task for three main reasons. First, because these are what we call multi-factor processes. There are different elements that characterize a system, as I mentioned before, which together co-evolve and influence each other at the same time. Second, they are multi-level processes. That means that the system can receive influences from different levels, such as, for example, COVID-19, which is something beyond the system, which is hard to predict or influence, or some small niche innovations that might attempt to enter the system. Third, these are multi-actor processes. So we have different actors, each with their different views, goals, objectives, which they are trying to navigate the system to a different direction. So based on all this, my PhD dissertation addresses the questions: how can decision makers be supported in the analysis and management of the waste management system's transition towards more sustainable operational modes, looking into the case of Ghana. My thesis is structured in 7 chapters. After the introduction, chapter 2 provides the theoretical backbone of my work. It is looking into the theories and frameworks within the whole literature on socio-technical transition. And in this chapter, I develop a framework that provides guidance for policy design and is also followed in the consecutive chapters. Next, chapter 3 describes the methodologies employed in my research. In total, I collected my data over 5 periods from 2018 to 2024, with the first one being, first 3 being in person and the last 2 online. The longest one was in 2021, still in the midst of COVID-19, which added some further complexities in my data collection protocol in order to ensure the safety of my research participants and myself. All this work resulted in 2 workshops, 16 field visits, and over 70 semi-structured interviews. The following 3 chapters provide the empirical work of my research. They address the question on, first of all, how sustainability transition happen in developing countries, so how we go from state A to state B. Second, what are the dynamics that lead to system-level inertia, or in other words, these lock-ins that prevent the system from moving forward? And third, where should we intervene in the system in order to make this change happen? Starting from chapter 7, here I investigated the first question on how do sustainability transitions take place in developing countries. I followed an abductive research approach which allows me to detach from existing theories and frameworks and take several iterations between empirical observation and the literature findings. To do that, I examined one particular example of a niche innovation in Ghana, namely the hybrid waste-to-energy. This is a very ambitious technology which is introduced over the last few years, which attempts to utilize waste for energy generation and contribute that way to both the waste management issue and the energy issues of the country through renewable technologies. The results of this chapter offer 4 main findings. First, we see that imported technologies are often selected by external actors, like in the case of Ghana, where the technology was selected and imported by the German government. Second, apart from the technological innovations that we are studying, we see also many non-technological innovations, or what we call frugal innovations, which are driven by the satisfaction and the need of basic survival needs. Like here, what we see in the picture with a local social entrepreneur who makes school bags from plastic waste in an effort to eliminate the environmental pollution, but also create value for the community. Third, transition pathways of developing countries are strongly influenced by landscape factors, which are these factors, these dynamics that it's really hard to change or influence, such as global market fluctuations or local institutional dynamics, which are not always so evident in developed countries. Fourth, we see that the informal actors here play a much, in many cases, very important role, equally or many times more important role than the formal actors in the system. And they're performing diverse activities at the same time with the formal actors. Next, chapter 5 explores the dynamics which lock the system in the current state and prevent a change, or what we call the system-level inertia. Here I employ feedback loop analysis along with participatory methods. The reason for choosing this methodology is because it allows me to dig deeper into the hidden structures and the mechanisms that prevent the system from moving forward. For example, if we think of the problem of increased waste accumulation that we face in cities currently, we might directly think of a quick fix, a solution, such as the expansion of landfills or dump sites outside the urban fabric, which will provide some immediate relief. However, in the long run, we have some unintended consequences, such as, for example, reduced perceived urgency or less investments in local recycling schemes, which can severely undermine the efforts and further contribute to the problem we face. So here, this chapter, I'm exploring if we are going for low-hanging fruits or if we are falling into low-value traps. This analysis resulted in 4 broad classes of mechanisms that lead to these system lock-ins and the relevant leverage points that could be employed as a solution. These can be broadly classified as normative, supply chain, economic, and organizational mechanisms. Just to give you an example, one type of a lock-in that we often observed in this first category of normative mechanisms is that of indiscriminate littering habits and not in my backyard syndrome, what we call also a behavioral drift in this research. An associated leverage point to this is that of environmental education. The picture here at the right is from an environmental education intervention we did in Accra as a side project to my PhD, in which we developed and implemented a course on circular economy based on the local contextual characteristics of the population, which has been received by over 1,000 students in Accra. And now the burning question that Chapter 6 is answering: where should we actually intervene in the system in order to make this change happen? Here I employed system dynamics in order to simulate the key structures that give rise to the problem and test out different scenarios, which scenarios target upstream interventions like at source separation at the household level, midstream improvements in the collection coverage, and downstream measures, including, for example, increased recovery capacity, or a combination of these. Here I evaluate all these different scenarios based on 3 key performance indicators as they are defined by my stakeholders, namely increased on-site waste separation, increased collection coverage, and decreased inadequately disposed waste. As I compare the performance of the different scenarios until 2040, there are some key insights that are derived from my analysis. First, we see that a universal collection coverage in the region and full elimination of dump sites, which are the two main goals of the government, were not achieved in any of the scenarios by 2040. However, we see that increased capacity in the treatment technologies, which is scenario 4, and circular city, which is the integration of the different intervention points in scenario 5, manage the greatest reduction in landfills and dump sites. Here we also see a warning remark, which is, as we run this simulation exercise, in the long run, we observe that urbanization rates and increased waste generation rates become much more prevalent and downplay the effectiveness of the interventions and the solutions we implement at the moment. In summary, my work has 4 main policy implications. First, it emphasizes the role and the importance of local economy solutions in driving circular economy transitions, along with local capabilities in both practical expertise, so the know-how, but also along the comprehensive understanding of the technological specificities, the know-why and the know-what. Second, we find that system literacy is found to be crucial for stakeholders to acquire deeper understanding of the system as a whole and the root causes of the problems we are facing, which often they were missing. Third, assigning local experts as intermediaries between technology owners and technology users for a more responsible deployment and evaluation of imported technologies is a key success factor, as we saw in Chapter 4. Lastly, developing self-sustaining structures that render the circular economy towards a more profitable option, which requires minimal constant government interventions, is also found to be a key enabling factor for circular economy in the long run. This dissertation makes a strong contribution to the literature on socio-technical systems and sustainability transitions in developing countries. It also shows how we can use modeling tools and methods in contexts where data are not easily accessible or available as in other countries. And it also provides operational insights for policymakers on the design and evaluation of transformative policies. After all this, you might remember, is there still hope? And my answer is clearly yes, there is. Sustainability transitions in developing countries is a challenge, but it's also a great opportunity. And it's true, we don't know enough about many of these countries, including Ghana. But I hope this work is an attempt to contribute to close this knowledge gap. And as I state in my 10th proposition, we need to work harder towards making hope possible rather than despair convincing. Finally, I would like to acknowledge that this work would have not been possible without the very generous contribution of my research participants who trusted me, believed in my research, and immersed me into their own realities. Thank you very much, and now I'll give the floor back to the prorector.
Thank you, Maria, for this very nice presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor René Kemp. Professor Kemp is Professor of Innovation and Sustainable Development here at UNU Merit, Maastricht University, and he's also chair of the Assessment Committee. The floor is yours.
Dear candidate, dear Maria, well, I want to congratulate you with having written an original and interesting thesis on a topic that's not very prominent in transition studies. You also apply methods which are not much applied, such as the participatory systems analysis. And so I think you're making an interesting and important contribution to the literature. The question that I have for you is why you didn't use developmental evaluation also as a framework with tools for investigating how waste management in Ghana could be improved. And developmental evaluation is relevant in taking a developmental perspective, which can also be very much system change oriented or transformation oriented through a theory of change, system literacy, which is also in your framework, and explicit attention to multiple value creation. So what kind of value could be created through an initiative. Together with Joop de Kraker, I supervised a PhD student, Tim Strasser, who developed also a tool called Scale 3D for helping change-oriented organizations to achieve an impact. It's also related to the model of solution design that Shyam and I have been working on. So it's more impact-oriented than business model-oriented, but if you can also identify positive value, which can be for communities or for the environment, it also becomes possible to attract funders. So it would be relevant, in my opinion. But I'd like to hear from you whether you think it's relevant and whether you thought about using it or whether you already have used elements of it.
Mm-hmm. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and for your kind words. So the issue of methodology and what exact approach I would choose was an ongoing process since the beginning of my PhD. And my initial motivation for moving forward with systems theory and system dynamics and this participatory approach was that I wanted explicitly to capture this whole component of the system. And one of the key difficulties I had from the beginning was the many different complexities that describe a system and the transition forwards. So it was not a straightforward application for me, neither in terms of theory nor in terms of methods, and I had to adjust both of them and bring them closer to the context of a developing country. For sure, multiple value creation and this also impact-oriented approach for funding issues was something that it's something that it's very much important for any type of transition, especially when we're looking for gaining stakeholders' engagement in this process. However, I believe I have used many parts of this process. First of all, in chapter 2, I tried to really look in all these different frameworks and theories and methods that describe and are available in the literature right now, and see how I can take the most treatable parts of them in order to construct my theoretical framework at the end of chapter 2, which actually guides the whole analysis and the whole design of the thesis. Also through the participatory methods, I tried very hardly to identify how the problem and the different values are defined by the different stakeholders. So I didn't want to go with a predefined definition, if you want, but I wanted to let this immerse and come out from these whole interactions and discussions we had. And the theory of change also is something that I think it's very much, we find many links also with the sister framework, for example, I discussed in my chapter 2, and also with the conceptual framework I developed at the end. So I try to find the balance between all these different frameworks and methods and theories in this whole literature. But surely I believe that if we move forward, and if I look also in chapter 4, which is about this very novel innovation, funding issues and is a key element here. So I think that would be a great potential also next step to look more deeper into this whole specific literature on developmental evaluations and see to what extent are we gaining, to what extent are we losing, and how can we convince the right stakeholders in this whole discussion. I believe the literature has still a lot of ground to cover in the field of developing countries, and I believe this is just a first step to highlight these hidden mechanisms, if you want, that define transitions before moving forward to some more concrete steps that we can implement here in developed countries, let's say. Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Henny Romein. Dr. Henny Romein is affiliated with the Department of Industrial Engineering and Innovation Sciences at the Eindhoven University of Technology, and she's also a member of the assessment committee. Floor is yours.
Dear candidates, first I want to congratulate you on completing this magnificent, wow, and weighty thesis, almost old-fashioned weighty thesis. And in particular because this sector is really so difficult to engage with. I mean, converting negative value into positive value, and then in that context of poverty, it is really maybe the most difficult sector to undergo a transition towards a more sustainable state. And you really dug in. I mean, you can see from all the field work you did, you were really engaged. So I really like that, because I also like doing field work and gaining an inside perspective. So I'm not so much going to challenge you on that field work part of it, but I'm going to challenge you a little bit about the choice of your theoretical framework. Actually, it was already, this topic already came up in your previous response. In response to your question by Professor Kemp. And you said, yeah, you weighed a lot of different frameworks and theories in order to come up with something that would do what you thought was right. But still, I have some misgivings there. I am not convinced in particular that the MLP, the multi-level perspective, and the TIS framework do the job for you. And why? Because both frameworks are very focused on innovation and factors fostering innovation and factors constraining innovation, factors that affect pathways to innovation. But innovation is that is the. But the other part of transition is that existing systems, the regime in MLP, has to break down. And there are also now frameworks that give this more weight. And I'm specifically thinking of a framework like the DRIFT colleagues have elaborated, the X-curve framework, where you see that the transitions happen when both these, the decline of the existing regime and the upcoming new practices actually coincide, well, tally at least. Both need to progress. And when you look at transitions in that way, then I start wondering, you know, whether statements that you make, that, for example, on page 39, there's a statement in your thesis that says the development of sustainable socio-technical systems in developing countries is a much more complex process due to systemic challenges. Yes, I can understand that you come to that statement on when you are taking the MLP and TIS perspective, because there are so many constraints on these innovation processes. But when you look at this need for system breakdown, you see something different. You see that actually we here in the West are much more steeped in a monolithic linear regime. And you see that also in your own review of the literature, that developing countries are not monolithic in that sense. There's a lot of informal practices that are circular, lots of agency, I would even say, in the informal sphere among actors that do very creative solutions. You even showed some on your screen today. So how does your framework, your chosen framework, affect the way you look at your problem?
Yes.
Did you? I'm curious if you also considered at your starting point other frameworks, and what could have been the consequences of a different choice?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your good comments, your critical view on my thesis, and all the questions and comments you raised. Thank you very much. So you actually tackle a very critical point for my thesis, and that was a debate and a struggle I had from the very beginning on to what extent can we really use and apply these theoretical frameworks, and to what extent they can really be useful for studying sustainability transitions in developing countries. And I have to be very honest with you, in the beginning, it was impossible for me to even apply the MLP framework in the context of Ghana. I could not properly define the regime because there were no clear boundaries. I could not properly separate the boundaries of the regime with landscape factors, because some landscape factors were very integral to the regime, like cultural, institutional factors. And I could not also properly distinguish what is a niche innovation, what is not a niche innovation, to what extent they're derived from the innovation functions that we see in the TIS framework, the technological innovation framework, and all these things. After many rounds of reconsiderations, I decided to try to dig deeper into this whole literature on socio-technical transitions, because it's quite thorough and extensive, and take it from a critical view. And that is the whole purpose of chapter 4, which maybe also took me the longer to complete, because there I wanted to see the frameworks and also see hand by hand the transition processes described in the literature on developing countries and how they apply these frameworks. So I have looked into 54 case studies, all in developing countries, and all they applied different transition frameworks. Some of them we already mentioned. So I tried to see what I can borrow from this and what can I learn from all these different case studies. And the results of chapter 4, actually, with these extensive tables that I have there for the landscape regime and niche innovations, for me provide a conclusion or a thorough, like a summary of all these key points I took from these case studies. So I have also considered other frameworks, as you mentioned, and I also looked into other frameworks in chapter 2, for example, the sustainability-oriented innovation systems, transition management. So I really try to be very open. But I'm also very well aware of the debate currently we have in the literature with this whole literature of goals, for example, some are advocating for creating new frameworks for developing countries, transitions. Some, they are more of the argument that we should stick with what we already have and adapt. If you ask, my opinion is that we do not need necessarily a new framework or a new theory. I think we have already quite some tools in our hands. However, what we need is to change the lenses through which we study sustainability transitions in this context. So I believe that the way we define the key concepts of the MLP, or the way we apply even MLP in this context, or the way we look into the innovation functions, it's quite different. And the concepts or the meaning behind some notions might be the same, but the way we apply them might differ. For example, as I mentioned with innovation systems, the innovations do not derive from necessarily high technological R&D laboratories. They might come as an urgent need to solve a problem that we face in our daily life. Or they're not well-funded entrepreneurial activities that give rise to these projects, or there is not a thoroughly focused national agenda that invests on different innovations. However, I believe that these frameworks provided, in my case, in my thesis, a good background to rely on this and start building on them. So that was my intention. I did not want to clearly use them per se as they are and take the definition as they are, but I wanted to use them as a background knowledge and see how can I best make use of them in the context of transitions. What is same, what is different, what can we learn and inform these frameworks back when we apply them in a different context, how should we refine our analytical lenses, and how should we inform our decisions better based on all this. So yeah, that's my short answer.
May I ask a quick follow-up question? Doing this, what you have done, the approach you took, can also lead to the danger that you are engaging in incremental innovation in your own work, not in the waste sector, but in your own, especially by reviewing all these case studies on transitions in developing countries that have been done in the past, because they used the MLP a lot and TIS a lot. Is there then not, to think of a metaphor, a danger of lock-in and past dependence here?
Yes. Thank you for your question. So while performing this abductive research approach in chapter 4, in my methodology explained that I did not look specifically for these transition frameworks. I just looked for transition studies and developing countries with a more thorough look into the framework. So I did not predefine only MLP studies or only TIS studies. But I looked more broadly on, okay, what are the transition studies in this field and within the developing countries scope. However, surely I agree that the majority of the studies, as you rightly mentioned, they are sticking with these frameworks. So indeed, there's not so much novelty here in terms of a new framework or a new theoretical contributions they were making. And that is something maybe I try to bring through this approach. And also this is the reason behind the abductive approach, because I didn't want to let the theory and the literature speak only, but I wanted to take it hand by hand with what is currently happening in Ghana. And the reason for choosing this waste-to-energy technology is not coincidental, because this is not a successful, as we define it, technology implementation. It has many gaps, many limitations. It is not going to fulfill the goal of the German government and the Ghanaian government. So it is not one successful case study that we can happily say this worked because of this and these factors. So both these gave me a more complete picture of what is not working, what we did not take into account while implementing these frameworks or while looking into the innovation system of Ghana in this case, and how these different functions might be different. What are we missing to complete the picture, or what is different? Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Hiroshan Heteyarachi, who joins us online. Professor Heteyarachi is affiliated with the University of Guam in the United States of America, and he's also a member of the assessment committee. Professor Heteyarachi, the floor is yours.
Hello. Hi, how are you, Maria? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes, we can.
All right, good. Thank you. Well, very nice seeing you again, and congratulations to you. You reached a milestone in your life. You have done a good job, and I am actually personally aware of your educational path in your doctoral studies. I know how hard you worked to produce this thesis and complete your research. You have done a good job. But I must say that I do see two different personalities. I do see one person when you are the writer of your thesis. I see a completely different personality when you talk. I think I must say that I liked your presentation a lot better than, let me say, I enjoyed your presentation much more than reading your thesis. Because I had some difficulties in some sections of your thesis. So it doesn't really say I'm not intending to undermine the enormous amount of work you have done, your hard work, but it's all about the clarity. So the question I am going to ask now, the first question is in line with what I just said. I just need to ask for a little more clarity on how you started defining your goals or objectives for your research. Because, you know, in research, we do understand what other people have done already. So that leads us to identifying the gaps, and then the gaps will help us formulate the research questions, a question or multiple questions. And then we define objectives, and then we do the research. And then we look back to see if we have met our objectives or not. I hope you agree with me, right? This is the research process as we understand. So you have done a good study to understand what is missing. Well, I enjoyed reading the section you did on defining the research gaps. And then to my surprise, you started defining your objectives before even talking about your research question. You just defined a few objectives, and then you went on to define your main research question, which was followed by a few sub-questions. And I started wondering, can you still do that? I mean, the objectives, defining of your objectives before talking about your research question made it look like the research objectives were arbitrary or optional. And I wonder if this was the same reason why I thought you were going here and there in some sections. I'm not going to go into your detailed chapters. Some of the chapters I had the pleasure of reading them before. Some of them have been published already. But I was wondering if you can give me some explanation on this jumping directly from the gap identification to defining objectives before introducing your research questions.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your comments and all the suggestions and your questions. They're all very well received. So, yes, I agree with your observation, and actually this process of writing the research questions and the objective was a very iterative process. So, as I already explained, I first had, it was a very inductive approach for me to come up with the research questions and the whole methodology structure. It started from my observations in Ghana, it started from other fieldwork I've done there, and then it gave rise to the questions that I'm going to address in the whole thesis. So this chapter, section 1.2 with the objectives and questions comes together for the reason that maybe if you want, I co-developed the objectives and the questions together. And while looking into the literature and while looking into the empirical work that has been done and all the existing challenges in Ghana and the scope of my research, if you want, it was very clear to me that there is a great theoretical, empirical, and methodological contribution that this research could make. And as I mentioned in the last slide of my presentation also, I wanted this research to have both a theoretical value, but also a methodological and a practical one for policymakers, for decision makers to be able to take something from this research and implement it. So the reason is that, so I started from thinking of what are the contributions I want to make together with the formulation of my research questions. And maybe I wrote them like that in the sense that I want to clearly highlight that the direction that this research is taking is not only making a theoretical contribution, but I want for other researchers who are doing similar work in developing countries on a different socio-technical system, on a different context, on a different country, to be able to use some of these pieces of the process that I'm following and some of these tools I'm creating to define their own analytical processes. So this was the main motivation, I would say. And then the research questions are attracting more, and they're talking more to the specific chapters of the thesis, which were then explained.
Okay. Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Wisdom Kanda. Dr. Kanda is affiliated with Linköping University in Sweden, and he is also a member of the assessment committee. The floor is yours.
Dear candidate, I want to congratulate you on this massive empirical work that you've done and the effort that you have put in to go into a new country in the global south and to really study this challenging socio-technical system of waste management, which essentially cuts across production and consumption systems. I really believe that you've also brought in a novel approach by combining theories from transitions and this system dynamic modeling. I also really appreciate the fact that you were not just studying the country from a distance, but you went in, got under the skin of the country, and actually teased out essential factors which really shape how these waste management systems develop. And yeah, good work on that. My question has to do with the fact that I was really struggling a bit to find out what is the knowledge gap that you try to address. And in between the lines, I read that you are trying to bring us new insights on scaling of experiments or pilot projects in this unstable, this fluid, this bendable, this corrupt institutional context. So two words, unstable and resource-constrained context. And this is not entirely new. Historically, there's been a lot of aid projects which has failed, from water pumps to electricity and so on. So I want to challenge you a bit. Can you tease out some essential elements? How can we scale up experiments in resource-constrained and unstable context? And these resource constraints can be knowledge gaps, knowledge limitations, finance limitations, and so on. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for all your comments, your questions, and all your contributions. Yes, so you're very right. This is not something new. We have seen that in the literature, in the developing countries, this unstable resource-constrained context is something we are seeing and studying. I believe there are three ways that we can scale up experiments in this context based on this research and the findings I have from my work. So first of all, the biggest contribution, if you want, and one that addresses the knowledge gap I myself found in the literature, has to do with the research approach we are following. So often enough, we see that we as researchers might come up with a predefined idea on the research process, or we have an experiment already that was successful in other contexts and we want to implement it. So the whole research process, as it is outlined in the final conceptual framework in chapter 2 and further explained in the following chapters, for me it's one of the biggest things I'm proud of this research, because it helps me to really go step by step into what is actually the system in which I am going to implement this experiment or this innovation, to what exact problems it is aiming to address, what are the potential trade-offs or unintended consequences, and to what extent the local stakeholders are going to receive it and accept it. So what is the process I have to follow as a researcher? The second way I would answer your question is through the whole work I have done in chapter 5, which zooms out while adopting this whole system approach and zooms in while adopting the causal loop diagrams. And this is again very careful selection of a methodology, because exactly I wanted to see what is, based on this whole literature on whole system approaches, what is these different systems and subsystems that define the transition sphere we are working on, but also especially zoom in into these exact mechanisms which are not really obvious or direct. And this is another key knowledge gap in the literature. We have this whole literature on path dependency and lock-ins and leverage points and path creation, but there is not enough work on developing countries. There is not much on the circular economy transitions in developing countries, and even more on the waste management system. So for me, looking into these hidden path dependency mechanisms and try with the participatory methods to allocate the relevant leverage points that could unlock these unsustainable lock-ins, it's another way to move forward. And the third way I would propose for scaling up an experiment in this context is exactly what I did in chapter 6. So chapter 6 actually builds upon the previous chapters and simulates the mechanisms that create an unsustainable pattern in the waste management system, and allows me to test exactly how this experiment that we're discussing could change some of these structures or parameters. Because if change can happen, let's say, only at the end of the pipe of the system, that might not bring the necessary results. Or how do we evaluate at the end? How do we assess the impact of this innovation and this experiment? Again, looking into this simulated type of exercise and allowing us to also account for the long-term trends, like the urbanization trends or the accumulation of waste. So my research provides this more holistic approach. Either we're talking about one niche experiment that we want to scale up, or are we talking about redefining and changing the structure of the regime itself and changing some of the mechanisms, or just observing and seeing how the system will evolve over the next years and making sure we take into account all these interconnected structures. So the whole work on systems thinking and system dynamics together, hand in hand with socio-technical transitions literature, is, in my opinion, a key element that defines how this process will move forward when we talk about niche innovations and experiments, and to what extent, what is the position we should take as researchers, but also how can we inform with this the people who are actually implementing this in the field. Thank you.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Serdar Turkeli. Dr. Turkeli is affiliated with UNU Merit here at Maastricht University, and he's also a member of the assessment committee. The floor is yours.
Dear Pro-Rector, thank you very much. Dear candidate, I would like to congratulate you for bringing together all of these chapters in a very coherent manner. It's a comprehensive text. I enjoyed looking at the little details even. But I have a question. I think this is the most important question for me in order to keep learning from you. So I believe you will be able to answer that. In your chapter 2, there's a table, it's page 69, conceptual framework for guiding policy design efforts. There, on the fifth row, it says policy design components, establishing a transition arena, developing a vision, pathway development through backcasting techniques, experimenting with pathway options, monitoring, evaluation, and revisions. All of these actions would be heavily relying on policy capabilities, existing policy capabilities. I think this is a huge assumption on the shoulders of policymakers or policy designers that they have such kind of capabilities in order to immediately start a discussion of transition arena without any kind of training about that or any kind of policy learning about that. So what you can say about these assumptions made about the capabilities of policymakers in being able to deliver these kind of actions? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much again for your kind words and your very thoughtful question. So yes, you're very correct in that sense, because the policy capabilities of the local stakeholders in this context is something that it's not taken for granted. First of all, it's something that, again, is defined by different dynamics, different processes. However, this framework in Chapter 2 and the steps that it outlines, it has, if you want, it presents two sides of the coin. The first one is to, given the assumption that we have these policy capabilities, if you want, to allow different decision makers and different researchers to understand what is the process and the steps they have to follow in order to come from a very problematic system state to something that could actually provide some solutions. So what is this research process and the associated methods and frameworks that they could employ in this way? And the second side of the coin, I would say, is that when policy, it's defined in different ways. And what I mean by that, in the context of Ghana, for example, we do not always have the decision makers or the policy, or like the policy given by the government in the traditional sense. So policy here can also take a broader definition. Policies can be also strategies implemented at local level, by the local municipal level, for example. Policies can also be something that is organized within a community in terms of orientation or a pathway. Policy can also be something that is implemented by local religious stakeholders in a community, that they also have a role to play in their own jurisdiction. So yes, we do take an assumption if we try to apply this framework in the context of a developed country, that policy capabilities are at the level that they can also follow up. However, it is also the case that we can think a bit broader of this whole definition of policy and try to see, based on the current capabilities of the decision makers and the policy makers, how can we best convince them on the different aspects of this transition process, the benefits, the negative aspects, the trade-offs, and the negative externalities that it could bring, and how can we navigate them in this process? So my answer is yes, there is an assumption if we define policy and this whole policy design cycle, if you want, as we do here. However, this whole thesis calls us also to think of different ways to implement and follow up with policy-making processes.
Dear candidate, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Joop de Kraker, who is a professor of sustainability assessment here at the Maastricht Sustainability Institute. Professor de Kraker, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear candidate, first of all, my congratulations with a very coherent and comprehensive PhD thesis. I note I chose exactly the same qualifications as my neighbor, which is, of course, no coincidence. So it's quite comprehensive, and it even includes a dynamic modeling study of the system that you researched, which is something I like because I've been a dynamic modeler for many years. But it's not something that I have ever seen before here in Maastricht. So, yeah, my first question is about this model that you developed and about something you wrote at the very end of your thesis. one of the almost last lines of your thesis, and I will read them here, is that one key initiative that you would like to see happen is the development of a user interface based on the system dynamics modeling work of this thesis. This interface, this tool, will allow decision makers to make more informed decisions and anticipate unintended consequences of interventions. That's what you wrote.
Yes.
And now my question is, could you tell me why this could be a very bad idea and a waste of resources?
Okay. Highly esteemed opponent.
So it may be a good idea, but it may also be a very
But
bad idea.
I agree, yes. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for all your comments and for your question, and thank you for asking me this question. So the system dynamics model in chapter 6 was quite a challenge in the whole conceptualization and construction for many different reasons. The biggest one of them was the lack of data and the lack of time series data that this requires in order to build a model that replicates actually what is happening in reality at the same time. However, it was a process, I would say, started from almost day one. So it took also a very long time until the model was constructed. The system dynamics model actually builds on the key mechanisms, the key lock-in mechanisms as they are identified in chapter 5, and test out different scenarios as they are identified from the leverage points in chapter 5 again. So it allows me to quantify and actually go from this very qualitative approach on chapter 5 to something more quantitative and see how do these mechanisms actually bring together the system performance.
Excuse me, I'm convinced it's a very good model,
Okay.
So no problem with that. But I think rough estimate of all the very good models and interfaces built on that and offered to decision makers to use as a tool, I think 95% is never used as such.
Yeah.
So maybe you could reflect on reasons why these interfaces are normally not used by decision makers.
Yes, thank you for that comment. So I believe it could be a very bad idea to build an interface like that for the main reason that it can be very much misinterpreted from the local stakeholders. And it is a huge investment because to build a model which actually comes as close as it can to the reality, it requires a huge investment. It has been also implemented in other cases. It's not the first model in a developing country, with South Africa, I think, one example. But the fact that the fact that we do not have, first of all, enough data to back it up, the fact that we have system illiteracy, as I mentioned in my comment before, and the fact that maybe stakeholders are not able to understand the usefulness of this model can also lead to adverse impact. The main reason why I wrote this comment at the last chapters of my thesis, the last pages of my thesis, is because I wanted to highlight and use this tool, not per se for people to say, okay, I can take this scenario, I can invest like that, this is the solution, but for them to understand. So it's more for me like a training and educational tool to try to help them understand this whole complexity that surrounds the system and how one decision might affect the other. You may know of N-Road or C-Road with this whole system dynamics tools that we are applying right now, and we have ready interface where we see what is the impact on CO2 emissions or temperature increase over the next years. So for me, this is more a tool that I can use to inform stakeholders about system literacy and help them play around these components rather than as a decision making.
So under what conditions could it be successful?
I think first and foremost, it can be successful as long as we have a good corpus of stakeholders represented and participating in this model and in this exercise. One of the biggest challenges is that we have a very much diverse spectrum of stakeholders, including informal also workers, that needs to be equally represented. And the second condition, I would say, is that they need to be readily available to really come debate, like as I did in my chapter 5, to have an open mind in the defense and the whole exploration of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maria Tomai, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Thank you.
Please all rise.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you grow. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Maria Tomai, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Ramani is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Dear Maria, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
Very good. Then, by the authority vested in us, by law, and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Maria Tomai, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university. I'll try to keep it short, okay? Because, first of all, congratulations, Maria. You know, they say that a person's destiny is not only shaped by circumstances, but the choices they make, the opportunities they seize, and the challenges they overcome. You got to know Maria's story. Okay, in 2017, latter half, I was in my office reading a very bad master's dissertation, feeling in a very grumpy mood. And there is this girl with these big eyes who comes and says, "Professor, can I speak with you? What do you want?" "I want to know if you can supervise my master's dissertation." "Where are you from?" "School of Business and Economics." I said, "Why me? I don't know this kid." She said, "You know, I want to do something useful. I want to do something good. And, you know, I just talk to people and they say, if you want to do something useful, you must go to Professor Ramani." So, you know, sometimes professors can have this mean streak at that time. I mean, so I looked at the kid and I said, "Look here, you know, I'm from India. I don't find any of the Indian cities as clean as Maastricht. Why don't you go and figure out how they got it clean? No, find out about the waste management system, what the Dutch do about waste and things like that." And so she looked at me and said, "How?" I said, "I don't know. You figure it out. You want to do something good? Find out about waste in Maastricht. I'll see you in 2 weeks." bye-bye. Because I had to rush to take my train that day. But in the evening, I told my husband, I feel guilty. I have done something very bad to a student. I should not have sent her like this. Then, of course, guilt was very short-lived. I forgot over the weekend. But 2 weeks later, there is she. And said, do you have a minute? Yeah, sure, come on in. And then she showed me what she had done, the people she had talked to, the case study she had built. Wow! So I said, okay, kid, you're on. I'll supervise your thesis. So she did an excellent job, and I learned a lot about the Netherlands and Maastricht. But then, D-Day came. You see, there is something called a second evaluator. I've had some bad experiences. I think a master's thesis is good on the second evaluator things. And so I got very worried what would happen. And lo and behold, from the esteemed School of Business and Economics, the guy had given her a higher grade than my high grade. So to date, Maria is the only one among my students, and I've had more than 100 masters, She's got a 9 in her master's dissertation. By this time, I could see that she had the potential to be an engaged scholar, and I said, why not? Why not? And I had some money. I had been studying sanitation on an EU project. I had some money, and I said, okay, Maria, I want to know about waste management in developing countries now, okay? Go. Where do you want to go? Do you want to go somewhere? And I was curious. And I thought she will take some time and all that. No, it came out, answer. I want to go to Africa. There is a song, Africa, there are many songs about Africa. So I started humming, and then I said, but where in Africa do you want to? I don't know, Professor. I've always dreamt of going to Africa. I must go to Africa. Thankfully for us, there is a UNU merit in Africa, and I happen to have a friend. Okay? And so one thing led to another, and she went to Ghana, and she took me there in the sense that she gave me such detailed reports. And I started thinking, and what happened is that I also do some NGO work. I run an NGO in India. She took that work to Ghana. There were many things she did alongside her PhD. She was a very engaged scholar right from the start. It is quite rare. They focus on their thesis. That's enough to stress them out. So the thing is, she did a lot more. And then when she came back, I had already applied for something called a local funding called SOL to make those people come and see how Maastricht handled its weights. And I needed somebody. So again, Maria was the one who organized it, and we set up something called Site for Society with Sardar here, Maria, to bring local technology, local entrepreneurs, local innovators into the classroom so that we can discuss with people who are doing what we are studying, So it was great fun, and she was part of it, at the heart of it. And then we tried for a book project, because now we had brought everybody from Ghana also, some people came here. And then we got it to study waste management in developing countries, and we put up a team. And I'd already gone to Ghana once because of Maria, because she said, you must come, Professor Ramani, and that's how I met a tribal leader. We went to slums, we had a great time. But here was a bigger challenge for Maria, because Maria was really the implementer, project administrator, to take all these Irish people who were very scared to go to a developing country, the water, the food, and their wives were very scared. I said, don't worry, Maria will take care of us. And then we went there, and she said, we are going to the compost yard. Those compost yards which you saw, the first nice picture that you saw? We went there. We went to recyclers. And the Irish were very cool. They said, oh, interesting. We are seeing interesting. Yeah, so all these things happen. And then here I asked her, by this time, Maria, why don't you do a PhD thesis? She said, what? I see all these students, you know, they're very nice, but they're very stressed. Again, to be alone without my family for 4 years? But I said, please think about it. I think you have a good deal. And then she said, yes. And she went about it very scientifically, found George. And there we are today. And she did so much in Maastricht University also that she was spotted by an American professor who visited. And she got a postdoc in the very prestigious Virginia Tech. So you come a long way. But I have one thing. Please, Prorector, one sentence for all her family and friends from Greece. George, you mustn't laugh. Okay? I've written it in Sanskrit because it's very phonetic, so I can read it out. Borite oli naiste poli, perifani yati Maria. Okay? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Tomai, also on behalf of the Maastricht University, I congratulate you with this degree that you have acquired. And now, before I'm going to close the session, so let me tell you how we want to proceed. I want to, after I've closed the session, invite the audience already to go outside and take your first refreshment. We will have 2 photo sessions here, so one with the people that are with us online and one on the stairs. And so we will stay here, and then you can already go outside. I close this academic session. Thank you.
Start.
Dr. Tomai, come forward.